unfortunately, she cannot come, and then I will try to present the paper. So this is so stressful for me, but I will try. Social protection, I'm not, sorry. Social protection floors are key policies and anti-poverty focus globally, and in line with the global push for social protection floors, low and middle-income countries have been creating and expanding cash transfers programs targeted to the poor. A variety of countries also are experimenting with universal basic income as a form of social protection, which allows each individual to receive a fixed transfer regardless of income. In particular, in the MENA region, Jordan and Tunisia have implemented social protection strategies and social contracts in order to emphasize social protection floors as key anti-poverty strategy, but not only, because there is also a focus on employment and earned income as well. So for example, in Jordan, one of the key pillars of the national social protection strategy is to enable families to be economically self-sufficient with the private sector focused labor market based on decent working conditions and social security. But the second pillar is also to provide targeted temporary social assistance to citizens who are unable to be economically self-sufficient, allowing them to maintain a basic level of consumption. One of the important issues in the MENA region is minimum wage and living wage. So minimum wages are designed to help ensure workers meet their basic needs. And globally, in context with the sizable informal sector, let me say that most literature working on minimum wage focus rather on the impact of minimum wage on different sectors. For instance, increasing minimum wage lead to increased wages in the formal sector, but we have null to negative employment effects in the formal sector. It could imply also a decrease or no changes in wage in the informal sector, but null to positive employment effects.
دكتورة سيرين لو تبطئي شوي عشان الترجمة.
Okay. It would also could increase prices. So for minimum wage, there are also differences across countries in who receives minimum wage. So first, not everyone could benefit from minimum wage legislation. So for instance, in Jordan, agricultural workers are not covered by minimum wage legislation. It was shown also that younger, the less skilled, the less educated, those working in the private sector and small firms are less likely to receive minimum wage, but it depends also on the context and country. So minimum wage is set by policy. So it is defined by the lowest wage that a worker should be paid, which is set by policy. In contrast, when we talk about living wage, so living wages are rather metrics of what it takes to afford a decent standard of living. And both minimum wage and living wage are different from poverty lines, which are minimum expenditure levels. So quickly, if we talk about the context in the MENA region, on labor market challenges, so we have high youth unemployment rates, low female labor force participation, and sharp dualism between formal and informal sector. The role of minimum and living wages in the MENA region is relatively high, but as I have precised, there is an incomplete coverage in Jordan. It was shown also by a study of Al-Hawarin and Creation that 16% are paid under the minimum wage in Jordan, and this is less likely for youth and less educated. For living wage, we have just 2 recent measures of living wage in Jordan from Wage Indicator Foundation 2020 and a measure with Anchor 2021 in rural Tunisia. So the most or the main important research questions of our papers are first, so we are asking which wage workers receive minimum poverty or living wage. We are trying to investigate the determinants of the profiles of people and the type and the works of who receives one of these benchmarks. Second, we try to understand also or to estimate the gap between what the wage workers receive and either minimum wage, poverty line, or living wage. So we are trying also to model the determinants of this gap. Third, we estimate the cost to provide a universal basic income, which is based on these three levels, or in order the cost estimated to cover the gaps, the gaps between what is earned currently and minimum wage, poverty lines, and living wage cutoffs. In order to compare these gaps with what is currently devoted to social assistance spending. So we are trying to see if we are really for or not from what is currently allocated as social assistance spending in a comparative approach between Jordan and Tunisia. So let me present first some figures about minimum wage and poverty lines in Jordan, then Tunisia. So we compare between nominal and real figures in order to see like the impact of inflation. And in Jordan, unfortunately, the figures shows that there is no, the inflation and the variation in the price index is not really taken into account in order to set minimum wage in Jordan. Moreover, in Jordan, we distinguish between a minimum wage for Jordanians and a minimum wage for non-Jordanians, and also by sectors. So we have a specific minimum wage for clothing and domestic sectors, and noting that the agriculture sector is not covered at all by minimum wage legislation. So if we try, we see the evolution over time of the minimum wage. So the minimum wage increases from, so it starts in 1999, and it increases from 80 Jordanian dinars in 99 to 150 Jordanian dinars in 2008. Then it has then 190 Jordanian dinars in 2012. It has stagnated until 2017 to reach 220 Jordanian dinars, and recently 260 Jordanian dinars in 2021. So the clothing sector has been covered just since 2006 by 110 Jordanian dinars, then domestic workers in 2009, but it was not adjusted over time. For non-Jordanians, so they are covered since 2012 with an initial minimum wage of 150 Jordanian dinars, and it was maintained until 2021 to raise to 230 Jordanian dinars, which is not far from the Jordanian minimum wage. For poverty line, so we distinguish between an abject poverty line and an absolute poverty line. So the abject poverty line takes into account only the monetary component of food, and the absolute poverty line adds also some other levels of expenditure necessary to afford non-monetary needs such as housing and education. So the poverty line, so following the estimations of the Department of Statistics in Jordan, so we have poverty line that starts at 96 from almost 30 Jordanian dinars per month, and then attains just in 2011 like 60 Jordanian dinars. And we didn't succeed to obtain more figures on poverty lines since 2011. So maybe we don't know. So maybe if the figures are not very precise, or if we missed something, please tell us. For the Tunisian context, so we see that in Tunisia, there is some consideration of inflation rates in adjusting minimum wage. And in Tunisia, we distinguish between a SMAG, that is a minimum wage for the agriculture sector, and the SMIG, that is for non-agriculture sector. And for the SMIG, we have a minimum wage for the 40-hour per week working and 48-hour per week working. So in Tunisia, the SMIG 40-hour, increased from 104 Tunisian dinars per month in 89 to 235 dinars in 2010, then to 301 dinars in 2014, and increases to 366 in 2020. The SMAG has also the same evolution with lower values of minimum wage than the SMIG, but since 2017, it starts to be near the SMIG 40-hour level. And for poverty line, so we have estimates from ENS. It was estimated about 50 Tunisian dinars in 2002, in 2000 to attain 150 in 2015. So for measuring living wage, so living wages are given by an amount received for a standard worker in a particular place sufficient to afford a decent standard of living. And for living wage in Jordan and Tunisia, we have succeeded to obtain a measure from Global Living Wage Coalition 2021, which is based on the anchor method for Tunisia. And for Jordan, there is a measure from Wage Indicator Foundation. So the anchor method is based on many components. First one is food, and also component of housing costs, cost of other essential needs, and a small margin is also added for unseen events. From the wage indicator, we have the same components of food, housing, transport, etc. And also a margin is added, of 5% is added for unseen events. Do you hear me? Just to be sure. Yeah. Okay. So living wage is adjusted by the typical size family, typical number of workers per family. So since we have just indicators in 2021 and 2020, so this is very recent measure and ways of computing living wages. So we adjust these figures to 2016 for Jordan and 2014 for Tunisia using inflation rates. Moreover, in Tunisia, we have only estimation for a rural living wage. So what we do is to use the ratio of poverty lines in rural to small and medium cities and large cities to map the living wage across areas.
دكتورة تحاولي تعملي conclusion للعرض.
Okay.
كم وقت بدك؟
Initially, it was 30 minutes, so I have just a presentation for 30 minutes, but I can maybe pass quickly through.
Go ahead.
Okay, so for data, we used the Jordan Labor Market Panel Survey and Tunisian Labor Market Panel Survey. And what we aim to estimate is whether, so first, whether earn a minimum wage or poverty wage, or living wage using logic model. Let me note that for minimum wage, we have taken into account changes across years. So minimum wages were adjusted in order to across years of the visit date. And poverty wages were adjusted for typical wage earners, family size, as with living wages. So for those who do not earn these benchmarks, we estimate the distance between what they earn and various benchmarks. So we model in log form using OLS. And finally, what we do is to size the gaps, so these gaps as an input into simulations of potential cost of different social assistance approaches. So as covariates, we have introduced some characteristics of workers like nationality, age, sex, etc. Characteristics of jobs, social insurance, type of contract, regularity of the job, required education or skills required by the job, and also some characteristics of employers like economic activity, firm size, percentage of female workers in the firm, and whether the firm is public or private. So this is these figures represent the cumulative distribution functions of monthly wage, and so it allows to facilitate the comparison of the various metrics and an understanding of what percentage of age workers earn at least these benchmarks. So in Jordan, for instance, 90% of wage workers earn the minimum wage, 79% the poverty wage, and only 10% the living wage. In Tunisia, we have only 74% of wage workers that earn the minimum wage, 78 earn poverty wage, and 29% earn a living wage. So we have much more in Tunisia that earn living wage than in Jordan. However, Jordan has the highest coverage of the minimum wage. But the minimum wage in Jordan is below the poverty wage, while in Tunisia, it is received by slightly fewer wage workers than the poverty wage. And in neither country did the majority of workers earn a living wage. So we can pass maybe through this. So for the main results of our estimation, so we will just focus, we have chosen to just focus on results of minimum wage. And let me say that the same determinants almost that explain the determinants of whether we earn minimum wage or other benchmark are the same as that explain also the gap between what is earned and the minimum wage. So for worker characteristics, the ages determinants, especially in Tunisia with an inverted U, we have found, while in Jordan we found that women are more likely to earn a minimum wage, in Tunisia women are less likely, especially for single women. We have found also that married are more likely to earn minimum wage than single, and in Tunisia married men are less likely. For nationality, we found that all other nationalities in Jordan are more likely to earn a minimum wage. So this is maybe explained by the fact that anyway, these minimum wage are lower than the Jordanian minimum wage. For some job characteristics, we found that social insurance and contract are determinants for earning the minimum wage. So those who are those who have social insurance in the job in both Jordan and Tunisia are more likely to earn minimum wage, but also those that have undefined contract in comparison to those that have defined contract are more likely to earn minimum wage. Okay, I can pass directly to firm characteristics. So we found in Jordan that the size of firm imports, since those who are working in firms with more than 100 workers are more likely to earn minimum wage than very small firms. And while in Tunisia, just those that are working at more than 10 workers are more likely to earn minimum wage than those that are working in firms with just 1 or 2 to 4 workers. Finally, we found that in Jordan, those that are working in public sectors are more likely to earn minimum wage than those that are in the private sector, while in Tunisia, the contrary result holds. So finally, for the simulation, so we have tried to simulate universal basic income and targeted wage gap transfers in order to compare them with the current social assistance spending in 2015 in both Jordan and Tunisia as a percentage of GDP. So as a percentage of GDP, so in Jordan in 2015, we have 1.1% of GDP that are allocated to social assistance spending. In Tunisia, it is 0.8. If we see the simulation that we have made for to cover the cost for a basic universal basic income, which is based on various levels of generosity given by minimum wage, poverty wage, and living wage, we found that it is very far from what is currently estimated. So, for instance, in Jordan, for living wage, we need 35% of GDP in order to cover living wage in Jordan, 17% in Tunisia. For poverty wage and minimum wage, so we have lower rates, but we still fall from what is actually devoted to, and these rates are not fiscally feasible. However, when we see the cost that is estimated to cover or to close the gaps between what is currently earned and the minimum wage, living wage, and poverty wage, we found that for living wage, it's still not feasible, since we need 12% of the GDP in order to cover living wage gaps. However, for poverty and minimum wage, it's much more realistic, since we need for Jordan 1.3% of GDP in order to cover poverty wage gaps. And for Tunisia, we need 1.6% either for poverty or minimum wage to cover either poverty wage gaps or minimum wage gaps. So to summarize quickly the findings of the paper, so the first key finding of the paper is that only a minority of workers earn a living wage, with fewer in Jordan than Tunisia. So minimum wages finally do not guarantee a living wage. The majority of workers earn at least minimum and poverty wages more so in Jordan than Tunisia. We have tried also to investigate some determinants of reaching wage benchmarks, and we have succeeded to do so with finding some demographic characteristics of workers, some job skills and education requirements, social insurance, regularity, work contract, etc. that are also interesting determinants. And finally, we were able to conduct some simulation, and we find that universal basic income and even targeted transfers to address living wage gaps require for more social assistance spending than what is currently undertaken. I don't know if I still have time to discuss some policy implications.
شكرا دكتورة.
Okay. Can I يعني ممكن أكمل with policy implications?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank
3
you.
minutes more.
Okay. So for policy applications, so our results suggest that most workers in Jordan and Tunisia were earning minimum wage, although enforcement gaps remain and need to be addressed. So the first main gap is that there is a large gap between living and minimum wage. And maybe policymakers may want to consider raising minimum wage. However, when we are talking about raising minimum wage, there are some trade-offs, because increasing minimum wage implies also increasing wages, which could decrease employment. Moreover, we can suggest like just important change could be implemented not with raising minimum wage, but either with indexing to inflation. So Tunisia is more closely tracked, but Jordan did not. So indexing to inflation would improve predictability, would allow to better cover basic needs, but could maybe diverge from fundamentals such as productivity. Another specific issue is that in Tunisia, for instance, we define, I didn't mention it, but in Tunisia for agricultural sector, it is either scaled to hourly. So the minimum wage is defined at hourly level and not monthly as the other minimum wage. In Jordan, it is at monthly wage. So what we can suggest is, because monthly minimum wage could disincentivize part-time, especially for instance for harm women, because women globally face difficulties in reconciling unpaid domestic labor. So maybe part-time work could and having a minimum wage, hourly minimum wage could help to address these difficulties. However, the problem is that it could maybe preclude living wages and lead to more variable monthly incomes. Moreover, hourly wages also could make Jordanians and Syrians more competitive with immigrant workers who work long hours. Another issue is that we have seen in both Tunisia and Jordan is that we differentiate in the minimum wage legislation between sectors. So maybe if we think about unifying across sectors, this could simplify and this simplification could improve effectiveness and enforcement, but maybe may make specific sectors less competitive. And finally, we could think about ending nationality-specific wage. So this is what we have in Jordan, because this difference between defining a specific minimum wage for Jordanians and non-Jordanians could desensitivize Jordanian employment. However, when we end also nationality-specific wage, this could lead to higher prices for goods and services, and specifically for harmed Syrians. Finally, for universal basic income and social protection floors, we have also some policy implications. So we have shown that it's not feasible to implement maybe a universal basic income that would eliminate poverty, because countries are considering lower levels of, or are thinking about lower levels of universal basic income. We could maybe suggest to eliminate subsidies for specific goods and instead providing cash transfers, something that Jordan has also implemented with eliminating some subsidies from fuel and bread at 2010, maybe, I'm not sure. And also, so finally, important political and poverty reduction trade-offs should be made between smaller universal basic income maybe and larger targeted transfers. So thank you for your attention. So we would be very thankful if you could help us, if there are, for instance, some aspect of policy design that we have overlooked for Jordan, if there are some interesting variables that we could also introduce in the modeling, and if there are current policy debates in Jordan that we could link to our results. And thank you so much.
شكرا لك دكتورة. احنا بسبب عدم وجود مناقش رئيسي في هذه الجلسة راح نفتح المجال للنقاش بشكل كبير، وراح نختصر من الوقت ربع ساعة على أساس تقدروا تحصلوا على وجبة الغداء بوقتها، بس ومع ذلك راح نتأخر لنا بضع دقائق. إذا في حدا من المشاركين عبر الزوم أو المشاركين في القاعة حاب يبدي بعض الملاحظات أو يطرح بعض الأسئلة فليتفضل. وبفضل أنا إنه اللي على زملائنا وزميلاتنا على الزوم يعملوا ريز هاند إذا عندهم أي ملاحظات أو أي أسئلة. تفضلوا. دكتور راقي.
Thank you, Serene, for this interesting presentation. I want to raise some questions about this notion of living wage, because to me, if something is not being paid except for 10% of workers, which is the top decile of workers, it doesn't seem to be a reasonable lower threshold. So, why should I believe these numbers? Anchor says that that's the way to do it, but why should I believe Anchor? Is it realistic to talk about these living wages that nobody is paid except the top 10% of the income distribution? So when it's so high, I'm doubting its usefulness as a threshold for a minimum that is reasonable for a particular society. I can understand the poverty wages, and I can understand the minimum wage, of course, but I want you to justify the living wage a bit more, given the very high levels that you found.
شكرا دكتور راقي. أي استفسارات ملاحظات أخرى؟ في الأستاذة نادية حسنات بتسأل متى ممكن تكون نتائج الدراسة جاهزة بجوز أو تنشر على الملأ. الدكتور راقي ممكن يجاوب على هذا السؤال لاحقا. No questions. يبدو الورقة كانت غنية وواضحة بشكل يعني مدعم بالأرقام، يمكن أنه يعني قللت من إمكانية الحصول على مداخلات. الأستاذة رفعت إيدها هون.
مرحبا، يعطيكم العافية على هذا اللقاء القيم حقيقة. أنا بعرفش سؤالي أوجهه لمين، هل أوجهه للمتحدث؟
قدمينا نفسك بس أستاذة.
أنا محامي اسمي حنان بنات من الهيئة الإدارية في اتحاد المرأة الأردنية.
أهلا وسهلا.
هلا هو في سؤال أنا بدي أقدمه يعني حول الأردن. السؤال هذا أنا بعرفش طبعا للمتحدثة أو للأستاذ أحمد يعني باعتباره خبير في هذا المجال. ما هي المعايير عادة التي تؤخذ بعين الاعتبار سواء في الأردن أو في تونس عند تحديد الحد الأدنى والأجور؟ وما هي إلى أي مدى حقيقة دقة مخاوف القطاع الخاص من أنه الحد الأدنى للأجور سيزيد الضغط على القطاع الخاص؟ هل هذا الحكي دقيق؟ يعني مما ممكن أنه يؤدي إلى تسريح العمال، أو هل هذا هو العامل الأساسي حقيقة اللي ممكن، ولا يعني توضيح هناك عوامل أخرى ممكن اللي هي يعني يعني هل الحد الأدنى للأجور هو اللي بيزيد الحمل على القطاع الخاص حقيقة، ولا هناك عوامل أخرى؟
شكرا أستاذة حنان. أعتقد هذا السؤال يفترض أن يكون مباشرا للدكتورة سيرين، وممكن تجاوب عليه بعد ما ننتهي من الملاحظات، باعتباره جزء أصيل من موضوع الورقة اللي تم استعراضها.
صحيح.
تفضل.
Thank you for this great question. So I think this is a very relevant question, but I don't have the answer directly. So this is a main element, I think, in the labor market in general. So this is an important element, but maybe not the only important one. But this is important because firms and are يعني should apply this legislation in order to employ people, and it is very important element. But maybe experts could have better answers in order to, because me also I would like to know if what are the other important issues that should also be taken into account in the labor market. يعني وممكن بس أجيب quickly على سؤال أستاذ راجي. يعني thank you for your question. I think this is also a great question, and until now we have just exploited what was computed, and this is a very recent measure of living wage. But this is a good question, and what we aim to do in maybe in the next draft is to try to better work on living wage. Maybe we could inspire from the anchor methodology, but to adapt it maybe better in order to have maybe a better realistic measure of living wage in Jordan and Tunisia.
شكرا دكتورة. في دكتورة إيرين رفعت إيدها بعدين نزلتها. إذا ما زال عندك ملاحظات دكتورة إيرين.
لا أنا رافعة إيدي. شكرا جدا على العرض الشيق سيرين. Do you want me to speak in English maybe? And thank you for the great presentation, Cyrine, and the great paper Cyrine and Carolyn worked on it. I do have 3 questions. First, I'm really interested in understanding more and maybe discussing the difference in results of the association between minimum wage and working in the public versus private sector in Jordan and Tunisia. So public sector workers in Tunisia are less likely to have minimum wage. However, private sector workers in Jordan are more likely to have minimum wage. Is that correct? If I read the results right. So I'm really interested in understanding the mechanisms and maybe your interpretation of this. How do you look at that? The second question, maybe comment, it's also more relating to living wage, because I see the gaps, the simulation that you did to cover UBI, to cover the gaps in the living wage, amounting to 35% of the GDP. That's going to be very hard to convince policymakers to do this, to spend that much. So I think maybe if it's possible with the data and with the definition, we could explore whether we can do a lower and upper threshold for this living wage. I do agree also with Professor Raghi Azad that living wage as high as only 10% of the workers earn it, it's not very reasonably plausible or implemented. The third question also is about the social insurance and minimum wage, because here there is an intersection between those, how to say that. I'm also thinking about this question of, if we introduce a minimum wage and we also want employers to insure their workers and everything, how to think in that and how to implement that in a way that does not hinder or de-incentivize job creation, decent job creation in the private sector. And my thoughts here are about productivity levels in the private sectors in both countries, and if there is a way to take into account productivity levels, maybe, or somehow. So yeah, I'm thinking about that also. I'm thinking of this paper in connection with the paper of expansion of social insurance. Thank you.
شكرا دكتورة إيرين. أي أسئلة أخرى قبل ما نرجع للدكتورة سيرين؟ تفضلي دكتورة. دكتورة سيرين.
Okay. So for the first question about the results found for public and private, so what is interesting is that we found that in Jordan, those that are working in public sector are more likely to earn a minimum wage, while in Tunisia, those that are working in private sector are more likely. So we didn't very explore the mechanism of our results until now. So we still have at the first version of the results obtained. But just a quick answer. Maybe I don't want to engage in answers, but maybe because in Jordan, higher wages are associated in public sector, while in Tunisia, in private sector, we have higher wage. So maybe this is an explanation of these results. For the second question about living wage simulations, of course, the rates estimated of the 35% of the GDP is unrealistic and unachievable. So even even to cover the cost of closing the gap between what is earned and the living wage, we have like 12% in Jordan, and this is still unrealistic. So as you said, so I link also the question with that of Mr. Raghi. So maybe the measure on itself is not very realistic with the actual findings, but we will try to work on living wage in order to better maybe or to provide our own maybe measure of living wage in order to improve this. And finally, the question on social insurance and minimum wage, I think how to implement a way to take into account productivity levels. So I think maybe experts could have more better answers about how to take into account productivity levels in order to link with insurance and to implement minimum wage. And also I could maybe link also with the question about what are the criteria of implementing minimum wages, because sincerely when I was working on minimum wage, I didn't really, especially in Jordan, I didn't really find what are the real criteria in order to fix minimum wage. So if you could provide maybe more explanations and more and more information about it, that would be very, very great. And also, if there are some issues that we didn't overlook, that we didn't encounter, or if there are actual debates about the Jordan labor market and the minimum wage, especially issues, that would be very great and very helpful in order to enrich the paper and for the next draft. Thank you so much.
شكرا دكتورة سيرين، وشكرا لجميع المشاركين واللي ظلوا معنا سواء على الزوم أو في القاعة. الآن نبدأ الاستراحة، راح تكون 45 دقيقة للغداء، ونعود الساعة 2 هون، ونأمل من زميلاتنا وزملائنا على الزوم أيضا يستريحوا لهم كمان 45 دقيقة، ونلتقي مرة أخرى الساعة 2 بالضبط. شكرا لكم.